So welcome to the 10-minute tutorial series, a series of, clue is in the title, 10-minute tutorials on the A-Level French Revolution course. Doesn't matter whether you are doing AQA, an Excel or OCR, this is the series of mini tutorials for you. Very important, go to myhistorytutor.com, website there. You can get yourself a copy of the A-Level textbook that accompanies this series. So what we talk about in the tutorials, we expand in great depth in the book. So make sure you go there. All right, let's get started with the lesson. A key component of why things are going wrong in France, the economy. So here we have a quotation from Arthur Young. Arthur Young was an agriculturalist from England who coincidentally traveled around France in 1788 and 1789, pretty much as the revolution is beginning to unravel. And there you can see that quotation from Arthur Young, essentially saying how shocked he was at the poverty he saw in France. And he compares it to Ireland, and Ireland at the time was regarded as one of the poorest regions in Europe. So that gives you some indication just how backward the French economy was and how bad the poverty was. So the French economy was heavily reliant on agriculture. And this meant two things, really. So, firstly, if there was a poor harvest, what would happen is that the price of bread would go up substantially. Most people's diet was about 75% bread. So if there was a poor harvest, that would then push up the price of bread because there wasn't so much bread around to purchase. This pushed up the price of bread, which meant that a lot of people went hungry. And for those that were able to afford the bread, the proportion of their income that they were spending on food could go up to 90 or even 100% of their wages. So what did this mean? Well, this meant that they just didn't have any money to buy other stuff. So another important industry at the time was the textile industry in France. But if you're spending all your money on food, or almost all your money, you've got nothing left over to buy new clothes or bed linen or curtains or any of the other stuff that the textile industry produced. So therefore, a bad harvest meant that other areas of the economy suffered, and you'd find that people were laid off from the textile industry when there was a bad harvest. What did that mean? Well, that meant unhappy people who couldn't afford to eat. And in terms of the government, what it meant was the economy would shrink and their ability to tax people went down, because if you had no income, you couldn't pay any tax. So a bad harvest had serious consequences for social unrest, but also for the ability for the government to collect taxes. You can't tax people if they haven't got any money. So this is a really important point to pick up on. When harvests are bad, it damages the wider economy. It lowers the total tax revenue that the government can bring in. And in the 1770s and 1780s, because the French government was so heavily in debt, they desperately needed as much tax revenue as possible to try and pay down the debt that they had accumulated. The problem was that when harvests were bad and tax revenues were low,
far from actually paying off the debt, they actually had to get into more debt to borrow the money they required to pay the day-to-day administration of France, but also to pay the vast amounts in interest they were having to pay on their existing debt. So it is an important sort of link there between the bad harvests damaging the economy, lowering tax revenues, worsening the debt situation for the French government. And unfortunately for Louis, that wasn't really his fault. There's not a lot he could do about the quality of the harvest. That was obviously dependent on the weather. But there's a strong correlation between the debt situation that France had and the occasional poor harvest that hit Louis, or France rather, under Louis's reign.
Agriculture in France was pretty backward. A useful comparison is that of England, who at that time in the 1780s was well under the way of agricultural revolution. New farming techniques and things like enclosures were introduced in England to try and uh, promote greater levels of productivity. France, on the other hand, was very, very backward. It had not tried the new farming techniques that the English agriculturists had tried. And it's worth just spending just a little while researching the difference between the English agricultural economy and the French, and then you'll see more of those differences. Quite simply, the French economy just didn't produce enough food. And there were many times when harvests were poor, when a lot of people went hungry, and there were, in fact, food riots pretty much just before Louis XVI comes to the throne because of a bad harvest. Unfortunately for Louis, the period from the mid 1760s onwards, there's a period of consistently bad harvests. And in particular, there's a bad harvest in 1788 and a very bad winter in 1789. And these are factors that caused the revolution. Um, he was just unlucky in that respect. Had there been really positive harvests, it's entirely possible to argue that the revolution would not have happened. Unfortunately for him, there were. So there were disincentives to expand production as well. One of the differences with England is that there were plenty of incentives for people to expand production. In France, there were less incentives. So, for example, um, you had to, if you were a peasant farmer, so a sort of small scale farmer, you had to use the facilities of your feudal lord to grind flour, to produce bread. You had to use the Lord's wine press if you wanted to try and produce alcohol. So if you've been growing fruit and you wanted to try and turn it into alcohol, you had to use his or her facilities. Okay, this meant you had to pay a fee. So that acted as a disincentive to expand production. In addition, there were further disincentives to expand production and to the free movement of goods across the country. And these were internal tariffs. If you have to, if you do choose to grow more food than your immediate family needs, um, not only are you going to pay tax on that higher output, but to move it to a different area to sell it, there are disincentives because you have to pay tariffs to go. For example, if you wanted to actually bring produce into Paris, you had to pay a toll when you got into Paris. And if you were going to a different region of France, again, you'd have to pay these tolls. So these acted as disincentives. You just couldn't make enough money to make it worth your while producing more than you or your family needed to eat. So as a result, the French economy just didn't produce enough food. Further context that's important to understand is prices were rising 3 times faster than wages. So if you look at the average prices of food the beginning of the 18th century and compare it to the end of the 18th century, you'll see that prices were about 3 times greater than wages. That meant people were having to pay a greater proportion of their wages just to buy food and clothing. So, in essence, people were getting poorer and poorer and poorer with each decade. Probably about 3 million people in the 1780s, about 3 million people were just about surviving. They just about had enough food to eat, but there would have been periods of bad harvest where they would have had very little food to eat. One of those periods, unfortunately for Louis, was 1788 and 1789.
It's worth just contrasting the struggle for day to day survival that millions of French had, and compare that to the life of incredible kind of ostentatious wealth and opulence that Louis and the members of his court would have enjoyed. And, the very fact that his wife was referred to as Madame Deficit, i.e., she spent so much money that it actually made the government deficit worse, tells you that the royal family, their spending habits were frowned upon by the ordinary uh, Parisian and peasant farmer. And when you are starving and you have virtually nothing to live on, to hear rumours of luxurious parties and food and fountains of champagne just down the road from you in Versailles, understandably, is going to make you very, very angry. And this is what happened, and is one of the triggers for the revolution breaking out in 1789. It's also worth mentioning why prices had tripled over the course of the 18th century. And that is thankfully very simple economics. It's just supply and demand. The demand for food had gone up dramatically because the population of France had increased at the start of the 18th century to the end of the 18th century. The population had increased about 40%. So that just means there was an awful lot more mouths to feed. There was just more demand for food. And as we've just covered, the supply couldn't match that demand. The responsiveness of the agricultural economy was not sufficient to meet that demand. So there was just ever a growing pressure on the demand for food. And eventually that would explode into revolution with yet more bad harvests in 1788 and 1789.
So it's worth just going to myhistorytutor.com, having a look at the book, because in the book I go into a lot more detail about some of the key limiting factors on the economy. So government created monopolies, forced prices up, guilds made it difficult to be entrepreneurial, operate as you wished rather than restricted by rules. And I go into more detail about things like the Ferme Generale, which was the tax collection system for indirect taxes, which was woefully inadequate. And you really need to understand that. So if you're going to sum up the economy, it's probably three things. So you've got the economy not operating at full potential because the economy is being restricted too much. It's not being let loose. The entrepreneurial activity is being restricted. So this means that the total income in the economy, basically you add up everybody's income, it's a relatively small tax base that the government can tax. What you want is you want a big economy, and then of course you can generate lots of tax revenue, but the government wasn't able to do that because the economy was still far too small. Secondly, the tax system itself was what we would call regressive, not progressive. So a regressive taxation system means that the people who earned the least paid proportionally the most. See, what you have in modern tax systems, like we have now, is you have a progressive system. So the people who earn the most money in terms of their income pay the most taxes. That's not always the case, but 9 times out of 10 it is. The problem with the French system of taxes is that the main income tax, the taille, was not paid by most of the nobility. Therefore, a fantastic source of tax revenue was lost to the government. That would have generated millions of livres if they had taxed the nobility. Finally, the system of tax collection meant that the government collected only a fraction of what it could have done. And that you need to look at the book and understand the inadequacies of the way that they collected indirect taxes. They were not collecting anywhere near the full amount. A significant amount was creamed off by independent companies that did the tax collection for the government. So as a result, the French government, so Louis's government, collected a limited amount in taxes. And if you're going to collect a limited amount of taxes, it's highly likely that you're going to end up in debt if you start spending tons of cash. And Louis, as we shall find out shortly in the future lesson, spent tons and tons of cash. Cash he didn't have because they weren't collecting enough tax revenue. So structurally, there was a problem with the French economy and the way they collected taxes, which made it very, very difficult for them to balance the books, i.e., to raise enough money to cover expenditure.
Okay, so that is the end of today's lesson. As ever, if you liked it, which obviously you have done, hit the like button, make sure you subscribe. If you've got any questions or comments, put them in the comments box below. If you need any help with your homework, you can by all means add a comment and I will do my best to help you with that. Our next lesson coming up is going to be a deep dive look at the three estates: the clergy, the nobility, and the third estate, everybody else. Who were they? What did they want? And what similarities were there between the three different estates? And were they in fact entirely different or not? So make sure you tune in for that one, coming shortly.